Hi everybody, it's good to be together again online for our continued study of the Ten Commandments. We'll be considering the 9th commandment this evening. And as been our custom throughout this study, we'll read the text up through the commandment being considered. So we'll read through Commandment 9 tonight, and next week we'll read the whole of them through the 10th commandment. So from Exodus chapter 20, starting in verse 1. God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and who keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold the one guiltless who takes the Lord's name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor, and do all of your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving to you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. That takes us up to the 9th commandment. This commandment against bearing false witness to our neighbor. And thinking back for a second, what we have heard so far, we know that these commandments were given to God's people in the aftermath of being liberated from a life of servitude and slavery in the land of Egypt. We know in the Exodus story as a whole that God rescued his people from slavery, for freedom, for wholeness, for life with the Lord and life together. And when they were in the desert in Sinai, these newly freed people, these Hebrews, faced a real issue because they had been enslaved for hundreds of years, according to Scripture. And the question basically was this: now that we have freedom, now that we have this freedom, what on earth do we do with it? Right? How do we live together in community? And these 10 commandments that we are studying are the 10 pillars for a life of true freedom for each of us as human beings, and I think for society as a whole. And tonight's commandment, the 9th commandment, is one such pillar, this commandment against bearing false witness. Now, in one respect, we've already dealt with some really heavy topics in these commandments, topics such as do not murder, right? Do not commit adultery, do not steal. And then from there, it seems to be building, but then it seems to go back to do not bear false witness. Why put, and false witness, as I'm sure we know, is lying, right? Why put lying up there with things like adultery and murder? What's God getting at in putting this commandment here? Well, I think there are two main reasons why, at least that I can think of, there's probably certainly more, why this commandment is included. And that is the fundamental idea that untruth, lying, deception, it destroys community. Deception destroys community. We think back to a fairly recent historical example from American history, back in the 1970s, I believe, the Watergate scandal, right? And many of us watching this will remember the Watergate scandal, whether we lived in America or elsewhere. And this whole huge crisis that happened during the Nixon administration, and the questions that surfaced at the start of it, but who was lying, who was telling the truth, who could be believed here? It was incredibly, from what I've read about it, incredibly controversial and challenging for people to sort through it, to understand what was happening, right? Was President Nixon lying? Were some of the investigators lying? You know, on and went, right? And the whole fallout from the Watergate scandal really caused a massive, just a massive schism in American society, and it really eroded a lot of trust in public institutions, right? And so that's a great example, I think, we see of how deception destroys or really threatens the stability of community, right? So not bearing false witness, or putting it positively, telling the truth is a precondition for proper relationships and proper order in our society, right? If we don't have trust in one another, if we don't believe the words of others, then if we think about it, we really have nothing at all, right? I mean, we can think about it for a second. Is it even possible to have a meaningful, life-giving relationship with someone who is a habitual liar? No, it's simply not. With such a person, everything that is said comes with a huge grain of salt and can be doubted, and we can twist ourselves into knots thinking, is this person telling us the truth or not? Right? So back to this commandment, do not bear false witness against your neighbor. Now that sounds like a very, sounds like legal terminology, I suppose. And that's really what the original intent of it was. The original setting for this commandment was in the setting of a court of law. Now, you know, the Hebrews didn't have courtrooms with all that kind of stuff, but about any kind of arbitration or dispute between people, right? So it's a warning against false testimony, giving false testimony, right? Because justice and freedom are subverted by bearing false witness, right? We see many dramatic pictures in our news today when people are called, probably before members of Parliament in the UK or members of Congress in America, and you know, they raise their right hand and swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and whatnot. And Hebrew society was just as concerned with the truth as we are. That in Hebrew society of the time when this was about, that every claim, we're told in the law, every claim had to be confirmed by 2 or 3 other witnesses. That one person's word was not good enough, but had to be corroborated by others, right? And in the time of the early Hebrew people, if a witness was found to be lying after the fact, let's say that somebody gave testimony that sent somebody else to prison, right? And then it was found out later that that witness was lying, then that witness would be given the same sentence as the person who was falsely accused. So if they were falsely accused and sentenced to 20 years in prison, for example, a deceptive witness would be then given 20 years in prison, right? And finally, the other precaution against bearing false witness that the early Hebrews implemented was that a witness against someone else, like in a criminal case, would have to be their executioner. Now that sounds really, really harsh. Think about that for a second. That it's one thing to lie about another person, but then you'd be expected to serve as the executioner for that person about whom we lied. So it's like a double moral whammy, deceiving somebody and then committing the act of murder as well. And so these were meant as safeguards, as protections against people coming up and bearing false witness against you. You better be sure you're telling the truth, right? And so the intent of this commandment against bearing false witness comes into everyday life for us. Because the truth is, when we're interacting with other people in human relationships, we're always evaluating, maybe on a subconscious or conscious level, we're always evaluating others and being evaluated by others. Is this person telling the truth? Is he trustworthy? Is she living with integrity? We're always asking these questions, right? And there's that old saying that sticks and stones may break our bones, but words will never hurt us, right? I grew up hearing that from various people. And I have to say, it's just absolutely wrong. There are few things more hurtful, few things that stick with us more than harmful words, than acts of deception, right? And this reality of bearing false witness can take on many forms. Sometimes it takes the form of just outright lies, just outright acts of deception. Other times, bearing false witness can take on the form of sharing stories without including or considering all the facts, like sharing a half-baked story resulting in a false perception of things, intentionally leaving out certain factors in a story that could lead to a different conclusion or different understanding, which then sharing only part of a story could result in false rumors or false understanding, right? There's also the problem of bearing false witness through inference, right? Telling a story or making a remark that could imply wrongdoing, planting seeds of suspicion and doubt about others. The scholar Darrell Johnson gives the example of somebody who was struggling in life and then suddenly got elected to be city treasurer, and suddenly starts wearing better suits. And somebody says, why aren't they dressing better since they became this high-ranking official? Implying perhaps that, they're not being completely ethical with the money in their charge. Right? Don't know. Another form of bearing false witness is exaggeration, a distortion of facts. No matter what form it takes, deception destroys community. It destroys community. It destroys relationship, right? And true community, the kind of community that God desires for us as human beings, can never, ever, ever be based on falsehoods, right? Any attempt to build a community on lies, on falsehoods, that attempt will eventually implode and harm everyone around it in the process, right? So this comes to another question about bearing false witness, though, and that question is it ever okay or right not to tell the truth? Is there ever a time when it is okay to lie? We're getting into some ethical gray area here, perhaps. But I think if we stop and think about it, we can admit that the ends seldom ever justify the means. More often than not, instead of protecting people, one falsehood then spawns more falsehoods, right? I really like a quote attributed to Mark Twain, and maybe others have said it as well, but Twain, I think, once quote that if you tell the truth, you never have to remember what you said. If you have a memory like mine, that's a good thing as well. But if you don't, then you always have to remember, I said this, and have to keep almost the falsehood narrative going by lying even more, right? Right. So with that said, though, maybe there are times when telling the whole truth is not the most helpful thing to do. What do we do if we come across somebody who gets a wild new hairdo, and frankly, it looks awful, right? And the person comes up and says, what do you think of my new haircut? What do we say? If we say, oh, it looks awful, what did you do to yourself? That's telling our perception of the truth, but it could really hurt the person, right? So what do we do in those kinds of situations? And that's a trivial example, but it could be applied to other situations. Maybe we can find a way in that circumstance to say, well, it looks like you're really expressing yourself now, or it looks like you're really feeling happy with the choices you're making, or something like that. You try and not lie to the person, but don't harm them in the process, right? That's a trivial example. Let's take a much, much, much more serious example, though, about is it ever okay not to tell the whole truth? What if we have a friend who is in an abusive relationship, and this friend comes to stay with us, and then the friend's partner shows up and demands to see the other person and asks if we know where they're at. Now, if we tell the full truth, then that could cause a lot more harm, right? So what do you do in that kind of situation? If you tell the whole truth, then more abuse could happen. So is it okay to lie then? What do we do? I think in more extreme circumstances like that, we have to remember that the intent of every commandment in these 10 commandments, the intent is for human flourishing. for human well-being, to seek the good of our neighbors, to love our neighbors as we love ourselves, to practice the true and higher law of love. And sometimes, and it's incredibly hard to know when to do this. I'm not going to minimize it for a second, but there may be times when, out of love, we do not share the whole truth, right? Think about what would have happened, in places like Nazi Germany, when people who hid people who were being persecuted, like Jewish people, for example, and if the Gestapo, the secret state police, came door to door asking, "Are you harboring Jews?" If they would just said, "I can't break the commandment. Yes, I am harboring Jews," they would have been taken away and exterminated in these awful Nazi death camps. So, by not telling the full truth, there people in that time are practicing the higher law of love and care for their neighbor, right? We're called to be people of truth, certainly, but we're also called to be people of grace, right? So if we're ever wrestling with how to tell someone the whole truth, we also think, what's the most loving thing to do, right? Okay. So the first reason why we look at this commandment is because untruth destroys community, it undermines relationship, and telling lies also goes against the character of God. We see in Scripture again and again that the Lord does not lie, cannot lie. To lie goes against the very being of God. That by its nature, falsehood always seeks out some measure of darkness. But God, we're told, is light. And in God, there is no darkness at all. Right? And we are called to be people of God, which means being people of truth. So more practically, how do we live out this call to be people of truth in our lives? How do we, in a culture which is all too comfortable with lying, pervasive lying and deception, how do we live differently? Well, one practical step we can take to honor this commandment is by biting our tongue, by not saying every word that comes through our head and then flies out of our mouth, right? That a lot of us are told when we're younger that if we have nothing nice to say nothing at all. And I think it goes also with if you have nothing true to say nothing at all. I've seen other people who suggest a different evaluation system where they say, before you say something, decide whether it's true, whether it's kind, loving, necessary. And if it catches on any one of those four, don't say it. That's a pretty good way to live by a principle of truth, I think. So we can control what we say, and we can also control, to some extent, how much untruth we're exposed to, right? We can, metaphorically speaking, plug our ears against untruth. We can be unwilling to participate in the sharing of untruth about others or about situations, right? Another good way to guard ourselves against the temptation to bear false witness is, before we say or do something, to put ourselves in the shoes of the other person. And how would we feel if whatever was being said about someone else was being said about us? How would that make us feel? Right? These are things to consider. So we can bite our tongues, we can plug our own ears against untruth, and we can put ourselves in position of others. And those are pretty good guards, I think, against indulging in falsehood and untruth. And no matter what the world says, no matter what our current crop of politicians has to say, I'm not going to name names, the truth always has and always will matter. And no amount of lying will ever change this. To suggest that lying can destroy the power of truth is like saying that I can take a clump of dirt, throw it, and hurt the sun. It doesn't happen. No amount of lying will ever destroy the power of the truth. And so my prayer today is that God would give each of us the grace that we need to be people of truth and of light, to live into this commandment against bearing false witness, to live into the higher law of love when we care for other people, and to pursue the truth in every aspect of our lives. Because, as the Lord says, the truth is what will set us free. So thank you all for watching tonight. I hope everyone's having a good week. If you're in need of any assistance or help from the folks in Kemnay Church, please visit the website, kemnayparish.church, to find the relevant contact information. And anything that we can do for you, we will do. And I hope you're all staying safe and take care of yourselves. We'll speak to you soon. God bless you.